So let's take a look at what is scope and what is binding. So let's take a look at this example over here. Over this code snippet over here that I just written, you can see that we declare a variable a and b, and then we have a function foo, and then b and c we declare within the function, and we're console log a, b, c, and over here console log a and b and c. Right? If you learn about scoping in JavaScript, you probably would know that there's a scope, there's a functional scoping, and then there's a block scoping. Right? So over here, as you can see, we have an inner function scope, and this is the outer scope. So what that means is that anywhere within over here, you can refer to a variable a and b, which is declared over here. And within this function, when you refer to b, you're actually referring to the b declared within the function rather than the one that's outside. But if you're referring a, then it's gonna refer to the outer scope a, and if it's referring to c, it'll be referring to the inner c in the declare in the inner scope, right? So if you ponder about this, you notice that scope is there's a chain of scopes where this scope is a child of the parent scope. When you're going to find any variables over here like a, then if it's not declared within this scope, you look up and you'll find the a declaration that is outside, which is the parent of the inner scope. Right? So how to look at scope for a node? Well, for example, over here we have this visitor for the program. To get access to that scope, you will call path.scope. Right? If you console log this, what you will see is that let me clean this and let me type again. Okay, so if what you can see here is that it's a scope that is declared in the parent, and let's see. So in scope, you have something called a bindings, and over here you can see that there's bindings a, b, and foo. So what is binding? Well, binding is a simple way to think about it is that all the variables that is declared within this scope, right? So we have declared a, b, and foo. So we have three bindings over here, a, b, and foo. Right? If you go into say, let's see, function that maybe I'm gonna call a variable declaration. And I'm gonna refer to the one that is okay, maybe a variable declarator will be easier. And I'm gonna refer to the one that is declaring b. So I'm gonna say path dot get id dot name. Sorry, path dot node dot id dot name. If this is equals to b, let's console out the scope over here. Right, sorry, I think we have two b's, so we're gonna say c. Right, inner, and let's take a look at what we're gonna have. Right, so the inner scope, you have bindings, but you only have two bindings, b and c, right? Because you only declare variable b and c in the inner scope. But the outer scope, you have three, a, b, and foo. Right, so you can get the bindings by accessing the scope.bindings.a, or you can use an API which is path.scope.getBinding. And over here, I'm going to say b, and if I console log, now you probably will see let's clear this, run again, you get a binding object, right? This binding will have all the information such as, for example, where do you declare this? This will be at the path. This path will be the path that you declared this variable. And reference paths will be an array of all the paths that is referencing to this b variable. So you only see one in this array because we only have one that is referring to this b, So the inner B is not referring to it because you know that B, this is referring to the B that's declared inside, right? If I change this to A, then you will see that this binding A has two reference paths. One is in here and one is over here, right? So this is binding, right? So what can we do with bindings, right? One thing we can do is probably once you find that, okay, probably we want to know that this is declared over here and I want to find all the A's and change it to something else, then I can get path.scope to get binding to get the A's binding in this scope and go iterate through the reference paths and then do your manipulation over there. And this will make sure that you don't manipulate variables such as, for example, you want to do something with B. This will make sure that you don't modify the B that is inside in the inner scope because this B is referring to the inner B. But if you're changing to A, you'll go change two A's, right? So this is what you can do with bindings, right? And if you take a look over here in the scope, there's also something called globals. So what globals means is that these variables that you are referring to, like think of it as references, is not declared anywhere within the scope. For example, over here, console. So in this scope, we've seen variables like A, B, foo, and then console and A, B, C. And we'll try to find, like, based on this scope and its parent scope to see whether when you have an identifier like A, B, and C and console, you're gonna see whether they to find the declaration. But you can't find any declaration for console, you can't find any consolation for C over here, then the globals would be C and console, right? And probably the node will referring to the node that is first seen in this code over here. So we've covered like scope and bindings. Let's take a look at some more APIs within scope that you can use. So one example would be rename. For example, over here, if I am at the program path, which is this outer scope, I'm gonna rename all variables like B to something else. I can do path.scope.rename B to D, right? And as you can see over here, all the D is changed. B is renamed to D, and then the inner B is untouched. Let's take a look at what else you can do. So as you can see over here, based on the bindings, we know that variables over here is A and B, and in the inner ones, you know this B and C is declared. So we kind of know that ABC, if you are inside foo, you kind of know that ABC is being used. You can't use it anymore. So if you want to come up with a new identifier, like a new variables that you want to declare, maybe declare some sort of a temporary variables and you want to use, and you are not sure like what is the name that you can use, then what you can do over here is that let's do an example. I'm gonna come over here and say, what is this? This is the block statement, right? So I'm gonna use block statement. Okay, so for example, I want to add another variable called, so I want to rename C to B, right? If I come over here and I say path.scope.rename B, C to B, what you can see here is that I basically declared B twice and this is renamed to B, right? So what happens is that, yes, I'm gonna find all the references of C and I'm gonna rename it, but I'm not in charge of make sure that this name is uniquely within the scope. So what you can do over here is you can generate a new name, which is generate new ID identifier. And you can provide like some sort of default name. So I'm going to say B. So this will give me an identifier node. This will probably tell us that B we'll try as much as possible to use the variable B, but if B is already declared in the scope, then you will suffix it with something, right? And I can use this identifier. So this identifier is a node, right? As you can see, identifier has a property called name. So I'm gonna say identifier name, and then probably you see that now we kind of prefix it with an underscore with something, so that this variable will itself, it's not we'll make sure that there's no name conflicts, right? I can do this multiple times, and over here I'm just gonna show you that if I call it multiple times, it will make sure that we don't have naming conflicts. So I'm gonna say name, and I'm gonna do it multiple times. Let me collapse this a bit. Right, and as you can see over here, if I rerun it, you'll see we're going to start with B2, B3, and you will make sure that names does not conflict. So so let's come over here to see. Let's change this to something like a bar, right? And so I have a function called foo, a, and then I have a function called bar, which is a. And one thing I want to do over here is that I want to rename my function foo to bar. So path dot scope dot and I want to do it in a very unique way where so probably I want to remove this. So I know that I have calling bar over here, and I just want to rename this variable foo to bar, and hopefully if I check the scope, this foo is the binding. We will have a new binding called bar, and then bar is referring to this has a reference to this call expressions. Right, so let's type some code and probably you understand what I'm trying to say here. So I'm going to say path.node.id.name equals to bar. Right, so I renamed it to bar. And over here, if I check path.scope.getBinding bar, and I console this out, I get undefined. So what that means is that if I rename it, I rename the variable this way, itself is not, the bindings in the scope is not updated, right? And so what should I do if I want the scope to be updated? Well, then I would have to ask the scope I would have to manually re-update or resync the scope. And what you can do over here is that you call path.scope and then call crawl. This will force the scope to resync. But if you take a look over here, it has no effect. And why is that so? Well, this is because the scope over here, the function declaration scope, is a new scope, which is the inner scope. We would and probably it won't see a function that this foo is actually declared in the outer scope, right? That's why if you crawl this inner scope, you won't update the variable, the function bar. So what we can do here is that we can get the parents of the scope, and then we crawl the parent, right? We crawl this scope. Once we've done that, then probably bar will be registered. After we change and we crawl again, bar will be registered in that parent scope, in this parent scope. And now if you get binding for bar, you probably will find it. And if you take a look over here, the reference paths as updated, you have one path, and hopefully this path is referring to this bar variable. Right, so we've gone through some APIs of scopes and bindings. And let's go for the last one, right? So lastly, you have path.scope.has own binding and path.scope.has binding. So you can pass in variables over here, like say b and b, right? So what this does is that we will return. So get binding will gives you the binding itself, but has binding will return you a true or false whether you have this binding, right? So if it's get binding will return you undefined, then has binding will definitely returns you false, right? And then the difference between has binding and has own binding will basically tells you that whether this binding B is declared within the current scope, right? So if you call it has own binding B, it's true. Has own binding C is true. But has own binding A, then it will be false. But if you say has binding A, then basically you will return true, because if it's not here, then you'll look for the parent, and in the parent, it is in the parent, so it will return true. Right. So we've covered let's recap what we have covered so far. So we talk about scope and bindings, and then we talk about reference, and then we talk about globals, and then we talk about how we can use rename to rename bindings, and then lastly we talk about how we can resync the scope by using crawl, and then we talk about how has own binding and has binding that tells you whether the binding is there or not. Right? Hopefully this is helpful for you.